Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Clemens. I'm editor of The Hill in Washington, D.C., and I think we're getting to a time where telling people that you've gone to GlobeSec is what we call a humble brag. And I think another humble brag is when people talk about going to Davos. But I'm going to open my session with a Davos story because it involves 5G, it involves these questions about telecom infrastructure, and a company called Huawei. So how many of you were in Davos? Let's just do a quick test here. A few of you. I know Michael Chertoff probably was and some others. Where's the hand that went up? You did, yeah. So didn't the wireless suck? It was just terrible, right? The Wi-Fi? You had an answer. In any case, the reason I mention this is that unless you're in the Congress Center where the Wi-Fi is really good, everyone else in that small village is just sort of a dead zone. Huawei had a giant display, and in a gesture of friendship and support of all of us who attended, they provided us private routers that we could then take and have anywhere. And I was sort of looking at this saying, this is like expanding the Belt and Road Initiative. This is Chinese infrastructure provided for free and at no cost to me, quite generously. And it raises a question I think we're going to be talking about today, which is as we build out the next generation of a communications infrastructure globally, this isn't just a US issue, it's not just a European issue, but right now the deal making going on about the next platform on which we are all going to be communicating and building businesses and exchanging is happening. And it just hit me that I didn't have an alternative to the Huawei thing, so I took it. I pretended to be happy. I'm not sure what they stole. I'm not sure the Chinese government was interested, but it raised interesting questions. We're going to come around and talk about this together. So let me invite a fascinating panel up to join me. First, Timo Koster is Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. He's the former head of defense policy at NATO. I don't know which chair is yours, but take the one you're supposed to. Then we have Rush Doshi, Research Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Special Advisor to the CEO of the Asia Group in Washington, D.C. And finally, Margaret Peterlin, Vice President of Global External and Public Affairs at AT&T, the former Chief of Staff at the State Department, and someone that I rely on to share as much on 5G as possible. I'm going to take this away from you. So as part of getting ready before we do this, let me ask you, where's my mic runner? I'm just going to do this at random. You're here? Come on up. Come on up. Just go to this guy. What's your name? Oscar. Tell me in 30 seconds what you think 5G is.
5G, I would say it's the backbone of the next economy. It's the jump from
platitudes, specifically.
It's the infrastructure that enabling a speed of internet we've never seen before.
Well, I think that you get an A, and you'd win the toaster in our world. But
Cheers.
Thank you for that. But let's do a quick poll of the audience. I put up 4 items. We could take a choose, but let's put up the questions on what 5G means to you. The answers you can take this out and you can vote for a little while here. The first is $5,000. That's what many people in Oklahoma, where I'm from, look at 5G as. A telecom infrastructure that changes everything. That is Oscar's answer. A telecom infrastructure that is hostage in a fabricated trade dispute. So we'll look at the other side of this. Or it's about 4,500 euros. You can go either way. So you vote on that. We'll see how that goes. And let me just start out with you, Margaret. Thank you for joining us today. And ask you to give me and all of us a quick primer on what you see as 5G. And I'm going to add one piece to this. Who are the big players in 5G?
Okay, so 5G, I always start with, it's actually not the next G. Despite how numbers work.
So it's not 4G?
It's not really the next
When the 5G
G.
shows up in the 4G spot on my phone, that's fake?
No, it is. What I'm saying is, though, because it's such a significant change in capability, you can't think of it as just the next in a numeric sequence. It's not 4G boosted. So this is an entirely different architecture. You're going from, there are 3 key components. You're going from latency that's about 40 to 60 milliseconds to less than 20. And so that people have a sense of what that means. When you're at the peak of performance as a person, when you're done growing and you haven't started slowing, so right around your 20s, Our reflexes are about 190 milliseconds. So we're talking about a system that runs regularly at 20 milliseconds in return trips of data. So it's near zero latency, which means that's why people talk about doing surgery from a distance. Another key component is the geo-precision. I know lots of people have been somewhere looking for a friend, looking at their phone map saying, it says I'm here, I'm clearly not here. And that's because the geo-precision in 4G is 4 meters. In 5G, it's down to millimeters. So that ability to, identify, target, be very specific on geo-precision. And the other is the intelligence of the system is moving away from this definable box. Go to the antenna, go to the tower, go to the box that has its intelligence. The intelligence is actually moving out of what was known as a quarantinable core into the network itself. And so those are significant changes. And that's why I say it's not just another G. It's actually an entirely different architecture to the system.
I want to thank you because I almost understand most of that, and it has that James Bond tension of the box and what's in it. But I want to ask you, who are the big players? Who's the big American player in 5G? Who are the big European players? We know Huawei, but can you guys give us just a tour very quickly of the big brand names that people ought to have in mind when we're talking about building out a 5G infrastructure?
Yeah, and I would say when you talk about players, right, there's equipment suppliers, right, and then there are operators, and then there are people who are going to innovate and take that opportunity. And in a population base of about 340 million people, we think there'll be a $500 billion increase in the economy.
Well, Huawei's in the provider category.
It's an equipment manufacturer.
Yeah.
Who's
the equipment maker?
Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung. We actually think that if we were to shift to an open and modular system, so you weren't, which improves the performance of a 5G network, then you actually would lower the barriers and get a lot more entrants.
Timo, let me ask you a question. Which would you have answered up here? Was it $5,000 or?
No, I'm from the Netherlands, so I would take euros.
You take euros. Yeah. But let's go from what Margaret shared with us a little bit on what the infrastructure. Why is this such a big deal? Why is your hair on fire over this? You attend these forums and conferences all around the world. You're quoted all around the world, and you said there's some real trade-offs. Why is this infrastructure one that has Donald Trump trying to shut down Huawei from the White House?
Well, first of all, and those people who attended last panel have heard it already, there's significant security and national security issues at stake. If your equipment or your network is compromised, that means that some actor from outside could actually access your data and access your equipment and operate your systems, which is clearly a security issue. Not just talking about weapon systems, but for example, in the Netherlands, our waterways are protected by big walls and doors that we can close, and you would like to have that uncompromised and make sure that it's only the government that can operate it. Apart from that, of course, there's a huge economic significance. There's a very important choice to be made. Who are you going to give this big infrastructural acquisition to? Then there's legal implications, there's political implications. There's clear that, for example, a European nation like mine is under pressure from both the United States and China to make the right choice, and from other nations. So there's international political implications, and within all those different trade-offs and those different interests that we try to weigh against each other, we need to make a decision fairly soon.
I mean, I guess the thing I've been trying to get my head around, and we're going to get this some comments from the audience during this conversation as well, but is whether or not Huawei is being unfairly maligned, that it happens to be a very successful high-tech company that's situated in China. China passed a 2014 national security law, a 2017 national intelligence law that basically says they can requisition any company, any person for the purposes of the Chinese state and Chinese intelligence. And because of this capacity that Huawei just happens to have, it's in the target. But it does mean that you could apply these same standards across everything. Is there anything unique about Huawei as a company? Why not ZTE? Why not about many of the other telecom related firms that are out there from China? Why is this one distinctive, or are we making a mistake here and not actually attacking the right target, which is to look at China's intelligence law and its national security law, which weakens any player in trying to sort of stand for open commerce and decent business practice.
So this is the key question, and the way we approach this in the Netherlands is that we not just look at Huawei, we don't even just look at China. We are trying to make this decision based on rather objective criteria, whether the technical specifications allow us to control the infrastructure and control everything we need to control, whether we're dealing with a country that has or has not got a program of cyber interference against us, whether we're talking about a country that has legislation that compels individual companies to turn over data if they ask it, whether it's a country that adheres to, let's say, universal cyber norms and not just subscribes to them but also implements them. But it's in a sense for us a neutral assessment that applies to any vendor, to any country that would have a stake in this game, and at the end will result in a decision that allows certain countries, certain vendors to take part in a competition and in an acquisition process or not.
Rush, if you're an expert on telecommunications policy, and he was telling me, I asked him what would you like to talk about, and he said I can talk about the full century of telecommunication. I said let's have a tighter sliver of that. But if we were sitting in Beijing or Shanghai having this conversation about telecommunications and looking at the United States, looking at the National Security Agency, looking at Echelon, looking at the way infrastructure of the United States has been used and tapped to monitor communications globally, including of people in Europe, tell me how that's not the same argument from a different perspective.
Yeah, let me just offer one quick caveat. I'm not an expert in telecommunications, although we have a project at Brookings.
How'd you get on this panel?
Where I work on China, which I hear is important for the discussion, but maybe not.
Yeah.
But look, if you look at over the last 100 years anyway, telecommunications has always been implicated in geopolitics. That's almost always occurred.
Right.
And we forgot that after the end of the Cold War. For a period of time, it became a little bit less of a salient part of geopolitics, and we got a little bit more complacent about some of the risks that are involved. But you go 100 years ago, you go back to Europe, you go to Italy and Great Britain, and you have the first major telecommunications equipment. Wireless telegraphy, the Marconi system, right? The Marconi system was revolutionary, but the British controlled it with the help of the Italians. And the Germans didn't like it very much back then either. So they built an alternative system with the help of the state. They spread that system around the world, and you got competition between the systems. And in many ways, it's a similar story because that competition was resolved in part by an international standard-setting body that helped decide what the standard would be going forward to take some of the competition out of the geopolitical contest. And you fast forward to today, and to your specific question, you're right. Telecommunications has been used by a number of great powers as a strategic asset, and that's why we should assume it will continue to be used in that way tomorrow.
Thank you for that. Just to go a little bit deeper, do you think that we may be off base? I mean, one of the things I'm trying to ask in this, because I watched and I wrote about the ZTE decision, both to take actions with ZTE, and then the arbitrariness that it seemed to sort of President Trump took the pressure off, and whether these are negotiating ploys, whether they are serious, deep, whether the debate deserves this attention is what I'm trying to ask. Does Huawei deserve this attention, or is this a ploy really about other issues?
It's not about protectionism. Oftentimes you'll hear the argument that this is a form of economic protectionism. But what is the United States protecting? We don't have radio access network manufacturers anymore in the United States, right? So Lucent and Motorola, the two companies that used to do this, are long gone. They were leaders 20 years ago, but they're not here anymore. The leaders are going to be increasingly European companies, South Korean companies, and maybe some Japanese companies that are good at base stations and radio antennas. And so it's not economic protection. So what's the issue? I think, as was discussed earlier, And on the previous panel as well, the issue is in large part security of data, secure telecommunications. It's also the fact that, as one of the members of the audience mentioned earlier, 5G will be the backbone of the global economy going forward. It's going to be extremely important. And so if that's the case, it makes a lot of sense to get it right on the first try. And I'll just end by saying, yesterday we had a great speech from the president, and he mentioned basically that, there were two risks he was worried about with telecom. One, that the information wouldn't be secure. And number two, that somebody might be able to shut down the network, right? They might be able to interfere, disrupt it. And I'd add a third one. There's also the possibility of continued dependence on a specific supplier, not just for parts and for material, but also for maintenance. And so all of this, you take those three, you put them together, and what does it equal? It equals possible political leverage. And as we're seeing right now, as globalization breaks down and technological supply chains fragment, leverage is increasingly an important currency in economic and political life.
So, Margaret, why can't AT&T just fix this? Not to put you on the spot, but I mean, AT&T is a big telecom for your carrier. You're not an equipment manufacturer, so you buy a lot in this. But I'm just interested in, what are the neat ways? What does industry have to get right on this side to be able to do this? And so, just in my quick survey, Huawei is huge. I mean, I think it's about half the global market. Tell me if I'm wrong. And I know just from talking, as I was preparing for this, China essentially just offered the UAE a cost-free infrastructure, which Huawei would do, essentially paying for it, if you will, at least on the front end. Can a Nokia, can an Ericsson, can a Samsung do that? Is there do you have to be a national champion, a global champion with sort of big subsidy power behind you to compete in this world? What do the rest of us do? I mean, it's nice to take out the moment, hey, we don't want Huawei, but what do you do if you're not able to compete at that level?
Well, there's a group of, I think, 19 or so equipment vendors and 60 carriers who created something called ORAN. And I won't stop there because that's not descriptive enough. But it's an organization that came together and said, this needs to be a diverse, sustainable supply chain built on fair competition that delivers the transparency and security that policymakers expect of it. And so how do you do that? You move from these closed interface, closed box systems where the intelligence was happening in that box over there and quite quarantinable to an open and modular system. And you lower the barriers to entry. So what can industry do? Industry can do what AT&T is doing, and that is participate in ORAN and say that, look, here's the opportunity. In order to really deliver 5G, it's really often about software innovations.
Right.
And so let's stop having...
Go open source, basically.
Kind of. What it really is creating open and modular components so that an Ericsson 5G can actually talk to a Nokia 4G, which isn't currently the case without custom coding that happens. So what we would say is make it easier for people to cross-fit items from different vendors. The other thing is you participate in standard setting bodies, which is what Rush was talking about. And I think in the 3GPP, all of these are so well-named acronyms, there are 588 international organizations, and it's very well organized to make sure that there's geopolitical balance. So what do? We participate in those, and we try to lend our technical expertise to it.
Let me just, before I jump to Timo, to ask him whether that'll work for Europe. You can represent all of Europe and tell us.
All right.
I'm a reader of David Ignatius novels, and so the latest David Ignatius novels. For those of you who don't know, David Ignatius is a writer for the Washington Post, but on the side he writes novels, some of which are made into Leo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe movies, and they're interesting because he's sort of a Michael Crichton type. He's taking technology that's a little bit further out and looking at what story he can tell within the national security space. And so one of the things he's written about, for instance, that intrigued me, which has now happened, is the hijacking of cars. So the ability to work through the Internet of Things, which is the connectivity, because another way to talk about 5G is how it is just a piece of the quantum computing and the artificial intelligence world that will link systems and cities and people and breathing tube machines in hospitals and the cars we drive, that literally zillions of things will be connected. And so there are pathways to systems. We've seen cars hijacked. So I'm just interested, in the dystopian side of what your vision? I mean, do you worry about some of these things coming down? I mean, how seriously should we collectively take some of the nightmare scenarios about systems being shut down by nefarious players?
Well, let me provide some data, and then I'll make sure that I allow Timo some space in this answer as well.
No, keep talking.
Well played. So when you look at the number of sensors, one of the other key components of a 5G network is the density of sensors. So in a Wi-Fi world, you could connect hundreds of sensors. In a 4G world, you can, in a square mile, you can connect thousands of them. In a 5G world, you can connect millions of sensors. So sensor density is accelerated. That also changes for people who are on the policy side, that also changes what the attack surface is, right? So when you look at this world and you see that, as you said, cars will be connected, somebody's kid's insulin pump is going to be connected to this infrastructure. There are lots of good reasons for policymakers to say, how do I ensure citizen security? How do I ensure national security while also creating and allowing the innovation to occur so that the economic benefits and the social connection benefits can occur. And just to give you a sense of the size currently, I think there's about 10 billion sensors currently. We think that there'll be 50 billion sensors by 2020. And in terms of traffic right now, just on our network, it's 263 petabytes of data that go across the network every day. And we're hustling as fast as we can to get that data to that sensor. And if you're logged into your kid's email as well, we got to get that to your phone and your kid's phone at the same time. And so there is going to be a lot attached to this infrastructure.
So, Timo, given what we just heard, and again, I know there are great benefits that also come from us all being connected: smart cities, efficiencies, the end of waiting for a parking space, perhaps all of this stuff. But I am interested in what Europe and what you and your colleagues, and I know that you've been very deployed in this, can proactively do, because it sounds to me like Ericsson and Nokia have scaling problems. I think they have problems not having a sugar daddy behind them that's moving investment and money on a cross-street basis. What are the things that you think are urgent to-dos on the European side of this equation to get both safety right, but also get scale for the companies, because you're very key in this?
Yeah. So security obviously is a paramount consideration, and the decision of my government will be, in the first place, based on what are the vulnerabilities of our system, how can we actually protect the system properly, and what kind of measures do we have to take, not just in our future infrastructure, but also in our current infrastructure, because the way we are starting to look at security is much more rigorous and intense than we have done over the past years. You could say that we've been slightly naive over the past decade. But of course, as a European community of people, of countries, there's much more at stake than just security. We have to have a market that functions properly. We have to have interoperability. We have to be able to protect data of individuals, because at its core, what we're talking about here is also a constitutional issue, the relationship between state and citizen. Privacy issues, etc., are very fundamental issues. It's not just a technological issue or a security issue. It's actually how the state interacts with its citizens. So for a government, but also for the European Union, who is coming into this game now, the European Commission has issued what they call a recommendation on this issue.
No, I'm just.
Are you okay?
Yeah. No, I'm getting a microphone for him.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what governments try to do is actually address all the different facets of this decision, and of course, especially in the public discussion, security is the biggest issue at the moment, so it gets the most attention. But to get it right, we need to have a look at all the other issues.
So what's the world going to look like in 5 years? Will you have gotten it right enough to both save your firms and be safe and be a player, or do you doubt? It sounds like you're pessimistic.
No, not at all. I represent the government, so I'm getting paid to be optimistic. So I'm sure that my government will get it right. But if you look at the difficult issues involving security, if you look at pricing, you mentioned that some of the providers, vendors, come in at a much lower price. Some of the vendors are not advanced to the same extent as others. So all those things will come into play. So depending on which vendor you choose, you're going to pay more, you're going to probably have to wait a little bit longer, and you're probably going to have a product that does something slightly different than another product.
Thank you. Rush, I was reading a paper, just the beginning of it. I didn't go too deeply, and you write well. But it dealt with China's role in forming the international financial architecture. And you had a kicker to it that blunting U.S. power and building regional order. I found it a very interesting frame. And so you're talking about global finance, global financial institutions, and architecture. What are the things you learned from watching that we ought to be careful and cautious of as we begin thinking about another next generation tech infrastructure, both within the geostrategic dimensions of U.S. power and Chinese aspirations?
It's a great question. Thanks for reading some of the paper.
No, I didn't go too far.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll tell you about it now. So the paper was about, and what I work on at Brookings is primarily, Chinese grand strategy. That's what I'm interested in, using Chinese sources. And the paper was about how, if you look at the U.S. the kind of dollar-denominated financial system around the world, the U.S. is a nodal player. There's a lot of ways in which it can exert its power over that, through that system over other countries. SWIFT is the main one that we often talk about, but there are other avenues as well, secondary sanctions, et cetera. And what we're seeing now actually is what I call this is structural power, right? It's power that you get from control over the structure through which economic activity takes place. We're seeing that happen again. We're seeing it not happen in financial space, we're seeing it happen in the technology space, where again, the United States is wielding some of its structural power to try to shape the course of politics, economic activity, technological activity around the world. And again, that kind of power depends on whether or not you have a nodal position in key supply chains for technology. So here, as we know, with this recent placing of Huawei on the US entity list by the Department of Commerce, those nodes, or rather those key blocking points are, chips and semiconductors, software, especially the Android operating system, and perhaps most importantly, but doesn't get enough attention, design software to make the next generation of chips, which is also in the United States. So if you're trying to find a way to innovate away from US bans, it's really hard to do that because the United States also controls the software to make chips in the first place. All of that is creating, a state of affairs where the overuse of this capability is going to lead others to look for
Ways to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Ways to be independent, right? So the real question we have, and this gets to the question you just asked, what are things going to look like 5 years ago? It's going to really turn on whether or not companies like Huawei can innovate their way out of this problem quick enough. And I don't know the answer to that, but there was a story the other day which suggested tens of thousands of engineers are working every day, 24 hours a day, to find a way out. And that company has been surprisingly effective and innovative in the past, so there's a possibility they'll do it. And when they do, the U.S. will have a lot less structural power. So that's how I think about the relationship between U.S. financial power and sort of the technological power. In both cases, if you're China, the right thing to do, the smart thing to do, is to try to blunt that power and build your own version of that, and that's where Huawei fits in.
Kevin Barron, who's the editor-in-chief of Defense One, has sent in a question on Slido, and I thought he did it from Washington watching us there, but he's here. So, Kevin, why don't you ask your question live?
I sneak up behind you. Well, yeah, I'm a defense reporter. I cover the Pentagon, and so my entry into the 5G conversation comes from the Joint Chiefs, who have really laid down a red line, saying they want nothing to do with any kind of Chinese-based network. They've been incredibly and surprisingly frank about it, and so I wonder, though, are they already behind the eight ball? Have they already lost that battle, and is the U.S. going to just have to find a way to make do with whatever network comes out, or are they right? Can they wait it out until some other non-Chinese version of the future comes forward? And I say that coming just from Singapore last week at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, where you can guess they're talking a lot about this there. But they're talking about the U.S.-China global power competition in other ways than counting ships and troops. And one of the examples was how China is, in what seems to be much farther ahead at working with other nations to build their systems and being the like you said, the sugar daddy, the benefactor, whatever it is, they're getting in with their influence, they're getting in with their technology, which is also getting them access to the data that they're probably going to get.
So, Margaret, let me ask you to answer that, if you wouldn't mind. Just to respond to General Dunford, do you see? I know you're a realistic strategist, you're a structuralist. Is there a path forward for us to get to a healthier place than we are today that would satisfy General Dunford's concerns?
Yeah, not having the same visibility Kevin does to what General Dunford has said. I feel a little careful about what I say, but I will also share that General Dunford was my Marine officer instructor when I was in ROTC. So I know him as Major Dunford.
And he doesn't forget that.
He's a great American. So here's what I would say. In the U.S., because of the requirements of the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, where there was a limitation put on any carriers operating in the U.S., that you couldn't provide services to the government if you had a substantial component, major carriers don't have anybody outside of Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei in their networks. And we're moving vigorously, and just AT&T is moving vigorously in 5G in 19 cities. So there is viability because we're doing it. And so I think that, again, what we see from a technical perspective is the nature of the 5G network itself should really result in interoperable at the component level hardware. And then really the discussion is about innovating on the software.
So before I jump to
but I
this
can't
gentleman
speak
here,
to.
before I jump to this gentleman here, if Huawei were to play nicely on that and say, we'll buy an interoperable line, we'll work on that, we'll go for global standards, would I shouldn't say your concerns, I don't mean it, should American concerns dissipate? Or is it just anti-Huawei stuff?
Really, as a member of the industry, I don't think I'm going to be the best person to talk
Government?
about policy.
If Huawei played with an open, I mean, if we took Margaret's proposal about what could do to get us to a healthier place, begin development, I'm trying to look at whether Huawei is just a really good, successful, awesome company that's getting wrongly maligned. If it plays by those rules, would you become more comfortable? I mean, I use Huawei in Davos. That was my point. You know, they're in a lot of places. So my question is there a pathway for Huawei to come into the happy tent of Europe's 5G world?
At the risk of repeating myself, we have not excluded Huawei. We have not excluded China. We are in the process of making up our minds whether it's safe and secure or not. There's many other considerations part of that, including the price and everything. So I can't answer that question. What we are looking for is a safe and secure infrastructure and a vendor that we can rely on, and behind that, a state that actually interacts with us in the way we would like to see them interact.
Terrific. Yes, sir. Tell us who you are.
Thanks, Hans Ack of ICDS, International Center for Defense and Security, a think tank in Tallinn. Timo, you started off by pointing to a specific law. I think we are overemphasizing one particular law, because do we really think that if that law will be changed, then Chinese companies would deny their state what state wants? When we are looking at a 5G, and it has been very elegantly said what it would mean, that basically means that we are putting all our future, all our technological future, into a one basket. And that implies a high degree of risk in a company, but also a country. Why a country? Where it is based, because I think this country should have a checks and balances what a democratic nation has. Free media, political opposition, and so forth. None of those China has. I grew up in a Soviet communist occupied Estonia, and I would very strongly encourage all of us not to trust a Leninist system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your comment, and it's going to lead me to jump to Anonymous, who's watching us from somewhere. And here we have, on the top, yesterday on the sidelines of Putin's and Xi's meeting, Huawei signed the arrangement to develop 5G in Russia. In context of newly announced strategic partnership, should we consider that Russia and China will work together on 5G? Might that let Russia to create military advantage against NATO, et cetera? So to come in part around the environment, the social and the civil, the values questions that we care about, here are two nations about which, at least the United States in our case, have some concerns. And I'm wondering, let me turn to you, Rush. Do you think yesterday's meeting is one of those strategic pivot points where we are going to say, wow, we should have been on this earlier?
No, I don't think so. I think it's part of a long-standing trend, which is tightening relations between China and Russia. And to some degree, those tightening relations kind of make sense. There's genuine shared concern between those two countries about the United States and its role. If you look at both of them, they've cooperated in other areas as well to undermine American structural powers. So Russia and China have both talked about alternatives to SWIFT, and they've worked together to find a way to create an alternative to SWIFT, which would prevent the United States from using that tool. When it comes to now technology like 5G, it makes sense that they might work together. It's interesting that Russia was able to overcome some anxieties that I know it had about this issue and move forward. But I think it is a sign, again, that this tightening cooperation will continue. I just wanted to add one thing, if I might, on the point earlier about the nature of values in determining which vendor you go with. I couldn't agree more that I think it does matter whether or not you're sort of a more rule of law based society or not. And I'll just say that, in some societies that are rule of law based, the key to that is having a constitution that you can take into a court and say, the Constitution says this is what you have to do. But there are some countries with Leninist party states, where if you cite the Constitution 10 years ago, it was interesting, you could get away with it, and sometimes it would actually lead to good precedent. But now if you cite the Constitution, you'll go to prison. So people should not generally assume that rule of law is going to apply in a country which doesn't have, the ability to actually invoke its own constitution in a legal case.
Timo, do you get top secret clearances? Are you cleared at that level? Do you know your secrets? I don't know, very high.
Secrets, Timo?
Hire me, yeah. So here's a question. There's I'm going to kind of take a couple of these, put them together, but there's one at the top here. But one is about security and economic issues. One is about if there are 50 billion sensors in the 5G world, do we have the technology to, this is getting back to the safety and security dimension of the question and getting it right. You were quoted in the Japan Times recently as saying, look, we really have to weigh these economic interests and questions against security. And I guess the thing is, I do hang out with people who have high clearances, and they know more than I do. And I get a sense from their body language on things like nuclear power plants, major key parts of infrastructure, both in Europe and the United States. And I go back to what the U.S. Allegedly, because it doesn't admit it did, with Stuxnet with Iran, where it delivered malware over a communications infrastructure, and the U.S. and Israel allegedly did this together. How far along on the potential threat is already embedded out there? When you look at the we're acting like this hasn't happened yet, and I'm wondering if we're actually all so penetrated by state-based players in this field that the 5G piece is another dimension of it, that we're acting as if we just get ourselves organized, maybe we can get it right. But I'm just wondering, in the world we have now, whether or not we've already got malware and state-based players that are able to pull a trigger and bring down, that there's a deterrence out there and influence beyond what someone like myself who's uncleared doesn't know about.
So this is not a matter of clearance, and if I had the clearance, I couldn't tell you. But
you could wink or.
Well, look at my body language.
Yeah.
So there's in my case, it's more a matter of limited technical understanding of this thing. But what is true is that in our current networks, 4G, 3G, 2G, there are elements of vendors that we may or may not trust in the future already embedded in it. So if we have at least part of our assessment and decision-making process in the Netherlands, it's not just about what are we going to do in the future, but also what is the state of our current infrastructure, and does that pose any vulnerabilities that we have to fix and patch immediately. And that's not necessarily immediately about your nuclear command and control when you're in the United States, but it could be actually some simple things that you don't want to have compromised either, ranging from your electoral register to, as I said in the very beginning, the doors that we operate to protect our waterways. The Netherlands is for 75% below sea level. So we don't want someone else from the outside opening those doors and flood the Netherlands.
We're getting near the close of our time together, but I want to ask each of you a question about how.
Can I just build on?
Sure, please.
Build on that, because I'll lend you a little technical expertise if you allow. When you look at the cybersecurity issues in 4G, and I think this is what you were talking about, those are cybersecurity issues that a lot of companies and and policymakers understand. So I'll give just a frame of reference again based on the network that I understand best. And that 263 petabytes of data that go across our network daily, there are 110 billion per day probes for vulnerability. And you know what that means for us? That means 4,000 cybersecurity experts with 10 or more years of experience working on that issue on a daily basis to make sure that that security packet gets to that customer just as it should without that probe succeeding. That's the surveillance cybersecurity issue, and there are a lot of companies and experts and governments that have a lot of understanding and experience there. There are solutions in the marketplace. The infrastructure control one is the distinguishing S-curve difference when you move to 5G. And so I think that we need to make sure we're very careful about it's not the same risk.
Right.
You're not managing for the same risk.
So the risk is a quantum leap.
And
higher.
that's an important point because it also shows that not everything is wide open at this moment and anyone can just enter anywhere and take over. That's not the case.
Right,
Yeah, not if you
We're
use that.
pretty well protected. At this point.
I want to get your final reflections in the last few minutes on something Brad Smith. Brad is the president of and COO, General Counsel of Microsoft, and he received an Atlantic Council award that had to do with their, comments about AI and human dimensions and creating human sensitivities, et cetera. But something he said was very powerful, and it's been haunting me for a bit, which is he said Microsoft had been approached by China and the Chinese government about playing a role in what we now is a massive data system and AI and facial recognition software and social capital. And Microsoft said, no, we're not going to do that. And it raised the question of whether or not those values questions are going to become big dividing lines for some of the big companies in the world. And we are really getting to, whether you want to call it a splinter net or a divided world, where major company, we have CRISPR babies that have emerged in China, not necessarily with the Chinese government support yet, but you've got norms and values playing out different ways in the next generation of technology advancement that we see. Microsoft said, no, we're not going to play that game, at least in this case. So I'm interested, and AT&T may have said no in some of these, I don't know. But the question is, do you see that this is an inevitable battle of values and technology ahead, or do you see it as one that if we step forward on standards and negotiating protocols, that we can avoid a big train wreck down the road where we have a super surveillance state basically in all we do? Margaret?
And Russia's the one who wrote the paper on it, but I go first. It doesn't surprise me that the 5G network is an attractive target for nation states. Think of all the value. I mean, I talked about on a population base of 340 million, we think the economy would benefit $500 billion and 3 million jobs. That's attractive stuff for policymakers. So I'm not surprised, given the citizen security issues, the national security issues, the economic issues, and the social connection issues, that policymakers are engaged on this. And I think what you'll hear from industry is, please try to harmonize your answer. And for those of us who are going to try to reach back here on the shelf, pull off a piece of equipment, we'd love to see a sustainable, diversified set of vendors who participate in free competition and meet the transparency and security standards. So this debate is not surprising. I think it's...
Rush, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the question of how technology is going to be employed is always a values question. It always kind of has been to some degree. It's especially true now because what technology can accomplish is so different from what we were able to do in the past. And so with 5G, we're going to have base stations that are, much more densely allocated across cities. There's going to be much more data, many more sensors, and more opportunities for surveillance. Now, that's not a problem just for, authoritarian states who might take advantage of it. It's also a problem for democracies because they'll have to come to terms with how they want to use that technology. And again, that's why a values-driven process makes sense. Ideally, they'll use it in a way that sort of minimizes the potential for abuse. So I think that ultimately, yes, there are real concerns about surveillance, censorship, facial recognition, digital authoritarianism being exported around the world, some of which is already happening, and we should be concerned about it. And ultimately, my belief is that it's going to be liberal states, United States, Europe, others as well, Japan and India are increasingly talking about these issues, especially Japan, that together will have to help set rules or be able to at least restrict some companies from doing business abroad that might want to support these efforts. And on that point, I'll just say one last thing before I know we're short on time, which is that the reason that, again, why is it that the US doesn't play in the space anymore? Why doesn't it have companies that are able to make the kind of stuff that Huawei makes? And part of it is when they went bankrupt, the US government didn't step in the way it did for Detroit, so that was a problem. Part of it was they didn't think strategically. They didn't think it mattered. Part of it was the government didn't play a good role in setting standards. And so these companies couldn't achieve economies of scale. They couldn't get capital. The conclusion of this is industrial policy matters.
Right.
Industrial policy matters in Europe. Europe already has 2 leading companies. The question is simply whether it wants to take advantage of that leadership or surrender it.
Thank you. Timo, final quick word, my friend.
Yeah, so this is an issue that is much bigger than your choice of 5G equipment and vendor that you're going to select. This is about state behavior. How do states behave in cyberspace on the internet? How do they treat their citizens? How do they treat each other? That's why we have already a debate that's going on for about 10 years already on norms for state behavior on the internet. Small pitch for a project that the Netherlands has sponsored. The Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace is, and actually Michael Chertoff, he's here somewhere.
Right, yeah.
He's the chairman, and they're going to issue a very important report in November that's going to set out not just the norms for state behavior, but also how we're going to monitor and implement them, and how we're going to make sure that no matter what kind of equipment you use, that as a state you're going to behave in a certain way, in a predictable and
well, look, in our first question when I asked facetiously about $5,000 or euros, sorry about that, but I was wavering between B and C on whether this issue was one that was a fabricated trade debate or actually a tech infrastructure that changes everything. Thank you for everybody, most people landed on B, but thank you for helping to explicate this and giving us a primer, because we band around the words 5G a lot without very deep understanding of the very component pieces. So I want to thank Margaret Peterlin of AT&T, Timo Koster of the Government of Netherlands, and Rosh Doshi of Brookings. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you. And I'm going to call the stage my friend Sean Walker, who's going to immediately take over the next session. Come on up, Sean. Folks, take off. So, Sean, I hear you've got what's your next session going to be?
So we've
How are
got,
you, sir?
Hi, good to see you. We've got.
I don't know if you're going to be in the future democracy, right? Whether
the past, the future, the present. Yeah, we've got a session on 1989, what it means today, old divides, perhaps new divides.
Did you listen to any of this discussion before?
We were
Do you
too
think
busy,
democracy can
unfortunately.
survive in a 5G world?
Well, that's perhaps one of the questions we're going to have to ask more intelligent people than me who are on their way up.
Okay, great.
Right.
Well, we're going to have to do that. Well, great to see you. Good luck with your
Cheers.
session.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
So if I could just welcome the 3 guests for my panel onto the stage. So we've got a really interesting panel this afternoon, last one of the day, but I think first there is going to be a short video. So thanks everyone for being here. All of you have managed to make it through to the final session of the day, and hopefully this is going to be a really interesting and stimulating discussion about the past, the present, and the future. We're talking about 1989, what it means today, perhaps the lessons learned. And I wanted to start by asking Ivan Krastev, 30 years on from 1989, how relevant is that dividing line of post-communist countries and non-post-communist countries in Europe? How much is that still a useful and relevant way to think about two Europes, and how much has it been replaced by other divides that are more important?
No, listen, of course it's going to be replaced by other divides, but it's the data through which you can try to think about a cycle and to understand in the long term what is happening. In 1989, in my view, talk about a long 1989. And in my view, this is a political process that started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and probably ended with the Arab Spring. And this was a process in which you have a major spread of democracies in the world. And then after the Arab Spring, three things happened. Of course, you have the failure of the Arab Spring itself, but secondly, democracies started also fearing the process of democratization outside of their borders because of instability, because of the refugee flows and others. So from this point of view, 1989 is important because it is a kind of a long-term perspective and trying to see what we are seeing today, not as a result of what happened yesterday and what kind of a wrong decision was taken on Wednesday, but basically we are seeing the end of a certain period, and we should try to understand what kind of period it was.
But do you think, just looking at today's Europe, having that experience of a system collapsing and a complete transition of the political system in some existential way affects people or gives people a different view on the world than people who didn't have that experience?
For sure. I do believe this is even within Europe. You have a major difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, because what East Europeans we're expert on is we're experts on fragility. We know how quickly things can change, for good but also for bad. And from this point of view, you cannot take things for granted anymore. Everybody who had 1989 as a personal experience knows that 6 days and 6 weeks is a long time. I do believe that people who do not have this experience don't know this, and they're going to learn it.
You think they will? Because I mean, I remember people in Moscow to me saying the same thing, that what's happening in Europe now reminds me of how we felt in the late 80s, where we thought all these things that we thought could never change are suddenly crashing down around us, and now we see this happening to the smug Europeans, and we love it. Do you think that's a bit of an overstatement, though? Do you think?
No, listen, of course, I'm not surprised that basically Russians see in analogy what they're saying, because for them the idea is why it happened to us and why it should not happen to the Europeans. But I try to believe that we're talking about something in a certain way much deeper. Psychologically, we cannot take many things for granted anymore. And even the European elections were very clear about this. Before, you have the feeling that you know what is going to happen. You remember in 1989 or 1990, then the Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle, coined the phrase, "The future will be better tomorrow." He probably had in mind the world, but this is it. Now, in Europe, part of the problem is that we believe that future was better yesterday. If you look at the survey that Bertelsmann did a year ago, 67% of Europeans believe that life was better before. So this kind of a feeling that we're losing something, that there is a period in which we knew what it is about. ECFIA survey showed that while the support for the European Union is higher than in last 25 years, the majority of people in every single European country, with the exception of Spain, are not sure that European Union is going to be around in the next 10 or 20 years. So this special anxiety, in my view, very much reminds the uncertainty of the late 1980s. It's not about 1989 only, but you have the feeling that you're on a kind of a historical crossroad and you don't know exactly what you're going to cross.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in a little while we'll come to the audience, so if anybody wants to put questions on Slido, you can do that at slido.com, as you probably know by now. Carolina, I wanted to ask you about Poland. We've just had this week the 30th anniversary of the 4th of June elections, and we saw this gathering in Gdańsk. I mean, the debates about 1989 in Poland today, how much are those debates about 1989 and what happened then? How much is it a proxy for the very contemporary debates in Polish society? I mean, clearly it's a bit of both, but how do those two things play into each other?
Yeah, it's very good that you are asking about the 4th of June celebrations, because it's actually a very good pretext to prepare a certain anatomy of Polish sadness, so to say. I have observed with a great worry those celebrations, because in Gdańsk, only a certain part of the Polish opposition was present, and actually it was a celebration of the heroes of the revolution of the 1989. But actually, it was very visible that those heroes are not accompanied by the young generations. And Ivan has been talking about the long 1989, and I would also like to say that it's not only the longest year in the 30 years of democratic transformation, but it's also a year that was never there. In fact, in my country, in the schools, 1989, the revolution, the story of the transformation was never taught. So we have grown 2 generations already that leave the schools without even mentioning how difficult, how complicated the transformation was. And so we have grown analphabets of the Third Republic, so to say.
And why has 1989 been sort of pushed aside then? Is it because people want to look further back to earlier periods of Polish history, and that this isn't seen as the sort of heroic reassertion of independence that it is in perhaps some other parts of Europe?
I think it's a very interesting question, and it goes very deep into the Polish history, where under lack of sovereignty, we always divided the world into the good people and the bad occupants, or the bad party who is occupying the country. But after the occupation was gone, the polarization somehow was implemented into the Polish debate. And today we have, I believe, one of the most polarized public spheres in Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the biggest reason for what you're asking about. This history was never told, because first you have to achieve a consensus. But this is this might be very short-sighted, and as a 40-year-old person with 2 kids, I must admit I'm extremely worried about it, because it looks today in Poland that we have grown liberal democracy of 1 generation. And really finding the key, the answer of how to revitalize liberalism is, this is a very tough question.
Mm-hmm. And Robin, I'd like to turn to you. Taking the sort of long view of this transition over the last 30 years, you were in Moscow in the late 1980s, just before everything started falling apart. And then you spent a lot of the 90s in this part of the world. And you know, we talk a lot now about the disappointments of transition, perhaps people who had extremely high expectations that things would change overnight. Is there also an argument to sort of look at it from a more optimistic perspective and to say, you know, after these European elections, yes, things are changing, yes, there's a slightly different mood in Europe, particularly in this part of Europe, but that really the amount of distance we've come is exciting and positive in a way?
Well, I mean, nobody wants to go back to communism. Okay, and that, in a certain sense, is it's an obvious thing to say. But let's remember where we started out. These were totalitarian states. These were some of the least free states that the world had seen in modern history. To have shaken off that, it was a tremendous task. I mean, I remember when I was in Prague in the 90s and here in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I remember very well one of the 2 Václav Klaus, who was the, how shall I put it, less friendly Václav of the 2. And he and many others used to use a phrase that it's easier to turn an aquarium into fish soup than to achieve the reverse. And the nature of the transition, the idea you were going to create, even some countries did. Czechoslovakia had a pre-war democratic tradition of sorts. Many others didn't. The idea you were going to be able to create functioning democracies in a generation is something that I think is magnificent. And I think overall, you've got to say that, I was going to say, you see, if it had been until last year, I'd have been able to say Central Eastern Europe was the great success, and then you've got concentric rings, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and then wider rings where it hasn't been. Hungary, for the first time ever, Freedom House downgraded a European country from free to partly free. What that means is that there is now a country in the European Union that is not considered by a very reputable organization as a functioning democracy. So your question about the European elections, to me, is a very relevant question time-wise, but it pales into insignificance compared to the big things we are starting to see happening in this part of the world. And as I say, coming back to a point that Ivan made, and it's very interesting that many of us grew up reading books and hearing comment about the 68ers. That 1968 was a formative generation, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Berkeley riots, the French people on the streets of Paris. We're very much 89ers, or most of us here. Some people may not have actually been born then, but put it this way, most of the people who are in politics, running politics, in the bureaucracies, in the think tanks, in the journalistic world, those who hold influence, for most of those people, 1989 was the single most formative event of their lives. And that has been both a good thing and a bad thing. It's been a good thing because it was a tremendous liberation, and it's also promoted a sense of optimism, a can-do sense. It's been I want to say a bad thing, it's been a dangerous thing in that many people in that generation simply assumed that what was achievable in a relatively short period of time in this part of the world could just be transplanted and translated onto places like Iraq, other parts of the world. As I said just before we came on, if it hadn't been for 1989, you could say that the chronology gets all messed up here, but it hadn't been for the change in the way Westerners, the Western intelligentsia, and political intelligentsia in particular, viewed the world because of 1989, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq. 1989 is why we invaded Iraq. There was a belief on the people who ran our political establishment that democracy could just be done very quickly. So there's an awful lot in there, but it's obviously fantastic for this country, for the Czech Republic, for Poland. You know, the question of whether it's been a disappointment depends on where you are. It also depends on who you are as well as where you are. You could be still doing very badly in Slovakia. You'd still be doing better, I think, than under communism. If you're sitting in Belarus right now, then there isn't very much to say that's positive about 89 and 91.
And just on that point with, Iraq, if you were to say that 1989 was in some way responsible for those sort of foreign policy decisions, is there a way that it was sort of the failure of Iraq, the sort of collapse of the Arab Spring in most places, is the pendulum swinging back now to a situation where people are more comfortable to say, well, okay, look, democracy is great, but if we've got some sort of fairly stable, problematic countries on Europe's outer fringe, perhaps who want accession, we would rather just deal with the autocrats who we know rather than promote democratic movement?
I think the answer to that is yes, and most especially and most importantly and most dangerously in the country in which I live, which is the United States of America. And it isn't just Donald Trump. Barack Obama was the pendulum swing. That was the pendulum swing. Donald Trump is the pendulum swing, multiplied by nonsense, okay, and aggression and chauvinism. But essentially, and this is the thing nobody wants to actually say, is that an awful lot of the underlying policy directional changes, and you can see this in the people and their thinking in the State Department, those were set in response to the Bush era inside the Obama era. And it is interesting how there is a lot of agreement. It's almost as if you cannot get even a country like the United States with a $716 billion defense budget, okay, just phenomenal numbers, enormous economic power. You can't get them to actually act in the world unless you give them a good reason to do so. And the problem is that because of the failures of Iraq, of the Arab Spring, places like Belarus, Russia, in a sense it has sapped the will to move the democratic agenda forward. And so I think, unfortunately, I think we have to bring in the digital revolution at some very quick moment in this discussion. I'm usually the only person who mentions it, so if nobody else wants to talk about it, then I'll use it in the book I'm writing about it. But essentially, there is no more energy. Nobody actually believes. Nobody's going to go out on a limb. Nobody's going to tell young men from Idaho that they can go out and sacrifice their lives in another part of the world for democracy when we've just had what we've had in Iraq over the last 10, 12, where are we, 15 years.
Okay, and before we go to the floor, I just will ask one more question that anybody can chip in who wants to. Something you said, Robin, was nobody in this region wants to go back to communism, which I think is by and large probably true. But something that surprised me, I've spent most of my career writing from Russia and the former Soviet countries, and clearly there the fall of communism is a much more complicated and nuanced discussion, and there's a lot of nostalgia, some of it genuine, some of it whipped up by politicians. And my assumption moving to Central and Eastern Europe would be that it would be 100% the opposite, that it would be very, very clear that this was a celebration and a national revival in countries. But it is clear that there's some kind of sense of, perhaps among Fidesz voters in Hungary, there's tapping into some kind of nostalgia for the Kadar period. I don't know if that's the case among peace voters in Poland. But just getting this sense of some kind of, certainly not a desire to go back to that system, but a nostalgia. And is that just old people wanting to be young again, or is that a disappointment with the current situation, or what are the roots of that, and how big do you think it is as a phenomenon?
I do believe it's different from country to country. In Bulgaria, basically, you're going to see that people in the polls are going to declare that the communist period, is viewed more positively than the post-communist period. Does it mean that they want to go back? No. But it means basically that they have the feeling that they have lost something, and also the pace of change was huge. More interesting is the Hungarian case, because in a certain way you have a combination of a strong anti-communism and kind of a nostalgia for Kadar. So what you don't like about communism were the post-communists after 1989. How quickly they became rich, and so on and so on. So this is, in my view, part of the paradox. I don't believe that people remember anymore what exactly it was, because the life has changed so much also on the level of everyday life, technology, and so on. But communism is as if going back to the 19th century, but there is a feeling something being lost, and interestingly enough, some of the most positive things that we like about the change, also the things that we are much more troubled about. Talking about data and surveys. It appeared that when you ask in all Central and East European countries what is the best that happened out of European integration and so on, people are going to tell you open borders, the fact that we can live abroad, that we can work abroad. What you're much more afraid of? Immigration, my own people getting out. So in a certain way, I want to keep borders open for myself, but on the other side, I'm kind of nervous because of the depopulation of the country, because of the fact that your friends are not there anymore. And this is, we always try to have a very clear distinctions how people view the past or the future. Unfortunately, people have a mosaic view. And quite often, the best and the worst is the same. And this is why we don't know how to talk about it. And this creates this intensity, because if you are talking about where the political energy is, and the last European elections it was quite clear, the political energy is either on the populist right or, for example, in a green left, but the difference in the way they disagree with the present is that, while the populist right does not like what the European Union is doing, the Greens don't like what they are not doing. No, but this is a major story from which point of view you basically disagree with the status quo. And this, the generational issue, which came very much also what Carolina said, this is a big issue. If you imagine the European election just based on the way how people under 35 voted, not 1980s, because for the generation of the younger people, 1989 is as remote as 1945 was for our generation. I remember in Bulgaria in 1980s, you have the story about the war and so on and so on. And you know about it. It's not that it was not in school. it does not touch on your experience. For them, 1989 is very much a distant history. And they remember other things. Iraq is an issue. Financial crisis is an issue. So to try to believe that what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe is a crisis of democracy is just a separate phenomenon, it is not. It's about the global crisis of democracy, and Central and Eastern Europe has a particularly colorful corner out of it.
I think it's very interesting to ask a question, which is, I think, the fundamental question: how it happened that liberal democracy ceased to be the ultimate goal, because it did. And I very much like what Ivan says about this global and local features of the countries. So let's focus for a moment on the Central and Eastern Europe and say that, well, basically one of the main reasons for which democracy is not seen anymore as the ultimate goal is the change of fears. So change of emotional structure, so to say, of the societies. The Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians after 1989 were basically escaping from something. They were fearing the past. And fear of the past is a great political emotion constructing the community. Thomas Hobbes already wrote that this is the emotion that actually also creates hope for the future, for the common good. But the fear with the generations, again, it has evaporated, the fear of the past. It has been replaced to some extent by boredom, and boredom leads to many passions, and it has been replaced with the fear of the future. And here, the migration, yes, here the refugees, I think, there are the face of the fear of the future. And I also wanted to make a remark on the paradoxical phase of change. 1989 is like the year with which Charles Dickens' book Tale of Two Cities begins. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of stupidity. And change for many people means something wonderful, yes, economical growth, technological change, the improvement of conditions of living. But actually change is also loss. And I think, I will just finish the sentence, I think the feeling of loss is the predominant feeling that is very well understood by the illiberal politicians. And these feelings, the liberal politicians, the liberal Democrats, are very slow to understand and to translate into their tales.
I was just about to pick up because you mentioned, both of you talking about, in one way or another, about identity and how people respond to change and how it can be formative of their identity. And I wanted to come back to 1989 in the sense of the end of history, because I think, in a sense, it's a bit of a cliche. People always will refer back to Fukuyama's book, and then somebody very clever will say, well, it says the end of history in the last man, and he didn't mean events would stop happening. No, he meant the end of history. That's what he meant. That's what his book was about. One thing that human beings crave more than anything else is certainty. The scale of the declaration that was made, and that book did encapsulate the times. It really did encapsulate. That is what people like me, I was 21 in 1989, but people who were sort of the great grand intellectuals that I looked up to, they believed it, and the politicians did too. You tell people and you tell the world and you tell yourself that history has come to an end. It does a number of things. Okay? In one sense, you could draw positive energy from it, because you really could say, right, let's go out and complete the task, hence the invasion of Iraq. Okay? That's where it comes from. There is a great danger, and people have not talked enough about the flip side of declaring the end of history. First of all, you're setting yourself up for a fall. If the entire edifice of your political intelligentsia believes in something which a decade and a half later is totally discredited, then, as in pride comes before a fall, you are going to take a hit from that. The second thing is it did certain very specific things. And this is where I think one gets to the heart of the problem in Europe and the European Union in particular, is that if history has come to an end, there's nothing left to discuss. It is the cornerstone, the starting point. This is what gives you the technocratic certainty that all you have to do is build. And it's interesting when you see some of the smarter writers on populism, like Kaz Muddy, for example, and he actually talks about not just the anti-pluralism of the populists, he's very right to talk about that, but points out, no, it's the anti-pluralism of the elites. That's the thing that's not discussed enough. Well, why would you be pluralistic if there's nothing to discuss?
Just the paradox of the end of history. Imagine there was something that nobody expected, the collapse of communism. And after it collapsed, we decided that we know what's going to happen in the future. This type of a certainty came out of the event that was unexpected. Because in 1990, there was a major panel of the top US specialists on Soviet Union that came with a report claiming that the chance for the Soviet Union to disintegrate was minimal. And there was a beautiful sentence. They said, big states, they made stupid things, but they very rarely committed suicide. And I do believe that this intellectually interesting story is that the more we fail to understand the world, the more certain we are about that we know how the future is going to look like.
I wanted to say that the end of history is really a very interesting metaphor. Robin said that it encapsulated very well the time when it was coined, but rarely we remember that actually the title of the book Fukuyama published was The End of the History and the Last Man. So if we were to coin a title that would encapsulate the time we live in, it would be probably The End of Liberal Order and the Last Lawyer. By which I mean liberal democracy has become a system of corridors of procedures and something completely ununderstandable for a common citizen. And also liberals failed to speak to the passions of the people. And this is, I think, the point we have to make to move forward and to think what might come next.
Can I, on the title only?
Yeah, go on quickly.
Forget about the last lawyer. It's going to be the first algorithm.
But this is it. You see, we've gone. How many minutes are we into this discussion?
We don't have that long left, which is why I want to open it up to the floor. But if you've got a cunning title,
in 5 seconds. And
yeah.
We have not talked about the single greatest change of the last perhaps 400 or 500 years, the digital revolution. This is something worth reflecting on. We go home. It's like, how did these guys have a discussion about democracy and the state of our societies and did not even mention once within 40 minutes the digital revolution? That is actually part of the problem, is that our political institutions are completely out of kilter with what is now technologically possible.
Okay, I want to open this discussion up now and ask if anyone has any questions for those of us here. Let's take one from over here first.
Hello, my name is Martin Vladimirov from a Bulgarian think tank called CSD. I think Ivan Krstov knows them very well. My question is a little bit provocative, playing the devil's advocate. You kind of, in your discussion of illiberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, there is a way of humanizing it, you know? There is a way in which you try to defend it, not directly, but in a way explaining through social changes, that this is a natural outcome of social changes. But I haven't heard in these 40 minutes, and I would like you to comment if you can, whether it's also the outcome of the destruction of institutions for the sake of private interest, for the sake of corruption, the sake of political corruption on a grand scale, that we call state capture. And whether this state capture is actually the reason why illiberal democracy is thriving, because it's the way to justify this major trend of shifting power and shifting economic resources.
Listen, there are two different questions. One is why people are voting for governments, and by the way, not voting for the first time. From this point of view, the results of the Polish elections are quite important. It's one thing when you're talking about a government basically being elected as a protest vote and basically you don't know how it is. And secondly, totally different when, as a result of a certain polarization and so on, you basically get re-elected. Corruption is a story, and of course, if you're in power, many of these regimes basically are using certain discourses in order to keep their monopoly of power. Hungary is a classical case of this. But if we're going to go only with this explanation, this is basically to believe that, listen, people are not supporting this type of regimes. The only thing is that they have certain control over the media, that basically this is the money moving. I do believe it's slightly more complicated. There is a certain type of a genuine support for some type of governments, and it has an explanation of the experience of the people, of the nature of the change. There is quite a lot of cultural and not only economic explanations of what is happening, and Poland is a great example of this. So I very much agree with you that when certain government is controlling 90% of the media, winning elections is easier. Helps. But at the same time, I do believe that if we're going simply to focus on this, we are not going to understand, for example, why certain people in countries that have their own authoritarian past are ready to concentrate so much, for example, power in the executive. And here's just one explanation from my point of view. Listen, the biggest problem of democracy is that on one level, the good news is that when you're losing elections, you're not losing too much. You're not going to lose your property, you're not going to lose your life, but it means that when you're winning, you're also not winning too much. And from this point of view, the major story and the major message of this kind of leaders is, where is the victory? What has changed for us? And they said, listen, the separation of power is just alibi for the elites to tell you why they're never going to do what they have been promising you. This famous impossibilism of Mr. Kaczynski. So the idea was, give me the power if you want a radical change. And because many people have the feeling that the change they have been looking for did not happen, there was a real kind of a seduction in this message, and you get the support for it. But of course, not everything is this. Polish government redistributed a lot of money towards certain groups, and they have been done as a result of it. So I agree with you that we should not over-sentimentalize the support of these governments, but on the other side, I don't believe that simply criticizing Mr. Orban or the Polish government is equal to understanding and analyzing. Blame is not, in my view, the best way to understand what is happening in your own society.
I would also like to make a remark on this, because this is of course true that illiberal Democrats are privatizing state institutions. And they can speak to people's interests. I mean, redistributing money by the Polish government is speaking directly to the people's interests. It is fulfilling their interests. It is fulfilling their expectations. So obviously, liberal Democrats are unable to do this today in my country and several other countries. What they can do is provide ideas, new ideas. And this is, I think, a very important point to make, because we are observing a certain kind of an intellectual phenomenon among the liberals, which might be called liberal defeatism. And it basically means that we somehow forget that we are liberals, and we think that everything is determined once and for all, and that nothing will change. Kaczynskis, Orbáns, and other politicians will win, full stop. Well, it isn't like this. And what is needed, I believe, is two things. Firstly, ideas. So we have to understand that nothing will be as it used to be. The Third Republic will never be the same country again. We have to create a new narration about it. The second thing is, of course, hope. Hope today may sound a little bit naive, but if 1989 is something important for me, it is a source of hope.
Okay, I think there was a question over here as well.
Timothy Garton-Ash. Our session is called On 30 Years of Democracy. I would like all three speakers to answer the following simple question. Is Hungary today a democracy? And if you're tempted to say it's an illiberal democracy, please explain to us why that's not a contradiction in terms.
Well, I totally agree, and I'm the first to say, sorry, Ivan, I disagree that illiberal democracy is a coherent term. I understand where it's coming from, but I don't get. No, Hungary. Look, the short and straight answer to the question is that Hungary has ceased to be a functioning democracy. The slightly wider answer to the question is that, let's not get all too anti-Hungarian about this, because the threat is that there are many more to come, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in other parts of the democratic world. And I think that, even understanding and accepting, I was on a panel in Tbilisi a couple of years ago with the McCain Institute, did this wonderful conference in September, and one of the people on the panel was insistent, a senior American, that this is just a cyclical issue. He's seen it all before. Sometimes, democracy runs into trouble, and then sometimes it has its ups and its downs and so on. And I was saying, and I'm going to say it for the third time, and it's fascinating to me, and I'll use it in my book, is that nobody wants to talk about the digital revolution in the context of democracy. And since they don't want to talk about it, I won't labor the point. Just wait for my book to come out. Okay.
Adam Przeworski has, in my view, the most minimalist definition of democracy. And this is political regime in which government can lose elections. I do believe that Hungarian governments these days has a problem losing elections. But from this point of view, I'm not going to say that Poland is a regime in which the government could not lose elections. So from this point of view, I'm much more going to use illiberal democracy with respect to Poland than with respect to Hungary. Because we're talking about regimes which are politically competitive, but at the same time you have a problem with constitutional rights of minorities, separation of powers and others, this clash between democratic majoritarianism and liberal constitutionalism. If you have a regime in which basically the system is so much sided that for the opposition, and I'm not going to be the one that believes that Hungarian opposition is the most creative things ever being founded, but I do believe this is a different game. And trying to make these distinctions for me is very important, because we started to use either liberal democracy or authoritarianism and so on simply as a label, also like populism. There is kind of a laziness, in my view, on the side of everybody. This is probably because of digital revolution and social media, but we're constantly outraged. We are outraged by everything that we see. Everybody whom we don't like is a fascist. Or communist, it depends basically where you go. I don't believe that this is the way, and making distinctions between this type of regimes is quite important. I have a huge problem in Hungary exactly about this. The regime is losing its competitive nature. In Poland, I have other kind of problems, but I do believe it's a competitive political regime.
I would say first that every illiberal democracy is illiberal in its own way. Let's start from this. But I do believe that we are basically more on a kind of continuum than we are completely arrived at some kind of system. I have been reading a wonderful essay by Hannah Arendt today, and basically I would say that Poland and Hungary both have departed from liberal democracy, and they are somewhere on the continuum to another system. But in the case of every of those systems, every of those countries, it is a different end goal, so to say. So Hannah Arendt says that there is a big difference between authoritarianism and tyranny. Authoritarianism is a country where the government is binded by law, even if it's very strict law. And this is where Hungary is going slowly. It's not there yet, but it's on the continuum. Whereas Poland is a different case. I do agree with Ivan that Poland is not similar to Hungary in many respects. Let's just take into account the strong political opposition. well, it lost the last elections, but to achieve almost 40%, I think, is a vast success. So they have found some new strategies. I think it's extremely important. But the end goal, I hope we'll never reach it, but the end goal of Poland is tyranny, because tyranny is the system where the tyrant is the law. And here you would have to say that a party that changes constitution de facto, not de jure, is a tyrant party.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to, if we can collect a few super quick questions, and then I'll give all of the panel a chance to respond. So, yeah.
Piret Kuusik-Estonian from Policy Institute, ICDS. Since the year numbers are a big thing, I have to say that I was born in 1992, so I'm the young generation. And when I listen to my parents, then one of the things that really kind of creeps my ear is that the expectations for democracy and what will happen after are like hair. And so if we take the topic of this GLOBSEC, navigating to disruption, is managing expectations on democracy, on progress and liberalism, one of the lessons learned. Thank you.
Okay, and one more, sure, let's take it here. But super quick if you can, because we don't have much time.
One brief comment and one question. For me, it's a sort of deja vu. You know, you talked and everyone talked about Fukuyama, but Fareed Zakaria wrote his essay on illiberal democracy in 1998. And so for people living in Slovakia, it is a sort of deja vu. We experienced it. Probably Slovakia was the only country which was mentioned together with other authoritarian or semi-democratic countries. But my question is, you were speaking, Robin, about 60s, 80s and 80s, 90s. Don't you feel that there is another, I would say, a possible historical milestone, that there are 2090s? These European elections have something suggested. And there is really, in many countries, young generation is simply coming on the scene, and it might be anchored in various political groupings and parties and so on, but still it can, to a certain extent, reverse this general trend of, I would say, a depression and everything what is connected with illiberal democracies.
Okay, thank you. We've literally got 90 seconds left, so whoever would like to make a super quick comment.
I mean, just very briefly on that. I think, look, everybody is so desperate about what's going on that the tiniest piece of relatively not horrendously bad news, which was the most recent European elections, is taken, now it's all over, look, the young generation, they're coming back up. And look, the problem is that we've got two things going on at once. The first is that an entire generation has grown to maturity with the invasion of Iraq and the 2008 crisis, which destroyed the confidence of a generation in whether our politicians can even tell the truth. And the second thing that's going on is that we are in the midst of a world historic shift that nobody wants to talk about, and it's called the digital revolution. Our politics...
I think you've got a book coming out on that.
Yes.
I will say something about the digital revolution because Robin wants it so much. So I just wanted to make two very small, quick points. First thing is, this is connected with the social media. Illiberal politicians are extremely entertaining, aren't they? I mean, they scare us and also they entertain us at the same time. So I believe that they have been extremely skillful. It's a populist entertainment. It's a populist statement.
Is Kaczynski particularly entertaining?
He doesn't have to be particularly entertaining, but from time to time he will go up and on the TV, on the national TV, he will speak about the refugees and the protozoa and bacteria in their bodies, and this is exactly what I mean. It is entertaining and it is seducing and frightening at the same time.
I've got a voice
seduced by bacteria.
I've got a voice in my ear telling you that you have to.
I just wanted to say that nothing will happen unless the liberals will start to be a little bit more entertaining without losing their identity, which is difficult.
Okay.
The other thing I just wanted to say is that I mentioned the continuum previously. If we are on a continuum, then this is reversible.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you.
On optimistic note, listen, King Lear has it. If we can say this is the worst, it means this is not the worst.
Okay, thanks everyone. I've been asked to tell you that GlobSec has put together a declaration calling on leaders and citizens to recommit to democracy, and you can sign it on their website, which is almost certainly going to solve everything.
solve everything.
So
This is the
please
most
do that if you feel
entertaining
like
thing
it.
that is going to.
Thank you very much.